The ship's approaching Rubicon. Wake up the dogs.
Establishing cerebral-coral connection. Link verified.
Hey there, pilots. This is Noisy Wren, transmitting the Rubicon Dogs podcast from somewhere out among the stars, bringing you all the armored core data you need to survive the battlefield. Let's get to it. Hello, everyone, and welcome in or welcome back to the podcast. I took a little bit of a break last week to get some things done, but I am back with the freshest of fresh information. As just an hour prior to me recording this episode, Game Informer released issue 357, which brings along with it a new interview and at least a little bit of new information regarding Armored Core 6. This interview and thoughts on the gameplay comes to us from Blake Hester and Alex Van Aken of Game Informer. And while there's lots more to read in the interview itself and lots more of their opinions and takes on it, I'm going to skip through a lot of that and get straight to gameplay discussion. The one thing I do want to note here is that it's a little bit of shame that the vast majority of information we get are from press and people who aren't really affiliated with the game, haven't played previous titles, or are just generally unfamiliar with what Armored Core is as a series. And while I by no means want to gatekeep the game from anybody and love all of the new players and interest coming into it, and while I understand that you have to use established media outlets as a source for press, it is a shame that we don't have a lot of thoughts and content from people who really know the ins and the outs and the history of the series as a whole. At the same time, I do see a lot of veteran players or content creators who maybe are more familiar with the series, but who, based off just a couple minutes of gameplay, or even less, are jumping to wild conclusions and posting really inflammatory stuff about how this game is trash, about how it's easy and dumbed down for beginners, or about how clearly it can't be hard because it's a Souls-like, or even just about the fact and the controversy that it is or isn't a Souls-like. Look, say what you want and believe what you want from the gameplay footage that you see, and certainly everybody is entitled to their opinion about what they do and don't like, if they want to proceed with actually playing this game, or maybe it does look like trash to you and you really have been disappointed. That's all fine. There's plenty of room for criticism and critique, and that's how companies and games grow and cater more to what their fanbase want. That's all fine, but we haven't had an Armored Core game in over 10 years now, and the overwhelming majority of fans of FromSoft games do come from Soulsborne series. Whether you think the game is a Souls-like or not, whether you think it's going to be easy or not, whether you think it's going to be trash or not, being this outright aggressive and inflammatory about it does nothing but alienate new players from the series. And guess what? No matter if you like the game or not, if it does badly, you can rest assured that we won't get another one. So even if there are things you wish were changed or weren't done the way that they have been, please, voice your concerns, but let's talk about it calmly and reasonably. And even if you don't like Soulsborne games, let's try not to alienate the vast majority of the FromSoft fanbase while being critical of the new games. Let's not trash talk an entire another fanbase simply because they like a game that you don't. And let's not assume that just because you've been around since the beginning of Armored Core, as have I, that anybody owes you anything, or that everything you say is somehow right and accurate just because you've been around a while. Just like how the fans are divided between which generation is best, 4 or 5, or even 3 or before that. In the end, all of your opinions are just that, your personal opinion. And while of course it's fine to have them, let's not go to war over it. And with that said, we'll actually jump into the interview. Now, the interviewers got to watch 2 hours of gameplay and numerous boss attempts. They witnessed a short prologue mission that they can't disclose any information on, as well as the level that we do have a little bit of gameplay footage of, where we infiltrate the RAD facility in order to destroy the smart cleaner. And judging by some of the phrasing that was used, it does seem like the two interviewers aren't actually that familiar with the series, which again is fine, but you have to take some of what they say with a grain of salt, as they may not entirely know what they're looking at in comparison to somebody who maybe has been around a little bit longer. And in that same way, I think that they had a couple of disappointing moments of gameplay, as they were coming at it really from an Elden Ring and Soulsborne standpoint, rather than an Armored Core standpoint. There's things that they saw that I would say are totally normal for the series, but that were disappointing to them. And I'll try to expand on that a little bit as we go through the interview and we hit those key points. Now, we know that the game is going to follow a mission-based structure as opposed to an open-world type structure from some of the other Soulsborne titles, and while it's pretty classically Armored Core, it may be a little new to people who are used to the Souls games and just getting into Armored Core. That being said, we know that the maps are massive, and they said that the various maps and levels will appear roughly across 3 to 4 missions each, with some locations being more prominent and showing up more often than others. They also talk about how locations are sometimes subdivided into smaller sections, and that you'd get to play a portion of a larger location. If we assume that the missions are actually fairly lengthy, which I imagine they are with the new healing mechanic and resupplying options, and the fact that we get multiple endings, I think there's plenty of gameplay through single player to sink your teeth into, which is great considering it does seem like the focus is on single player in this game, though I'm sure we all really wish that they would reveal some multiplayer info. So the stage that they got to watch was the second stage of Chapter 2, at Grid 086, and there's definitely some new info here on this level itself. It houses an orbital lift, the Intercontinental Cargo Launcher, and callsign Raven, who is you in the game, must use the cargo launcher to cross the ocean to the central ice field, what is promised to be an important location in the game. One interesting thing to note here, at least according to the interviewers, is that you've already been given the callsign Raven. And of course, we've heard this talked about in some of the trailers and gameplay footage, but it's definitely a little bit different for Armored Core, as you've always just developed your pilot name, AC name, logo, etc. right at the start of the game. You've never really had an identity, and so the player was able to kind of self-insert themselves into the game as their own mercenary. And even though we don't really have confirmation, it's sounding like that is changed up a little bit here, and that you do have at least a little bit of an identity, although it is vague. You also presumably start out with that same Raven logo that we see in the pre-order bonuses, potentially as opposed to being able to choose your own logo from at least a couple of starting options before getting your chance to make your own. And while I have to imagine you can edit your own emblem in this one, as you've always been able to do, and I don't see them removing that, it's interesting that you potentially have a specific one you start with and a little bit more identity in this one. You even have a human plus number, or maybe I should call it an augmented human number. I gotta say I don't know if I'm a huge fan of this, as I think part of the appeal of the Armored Core game has always been that fact that you're kind of your own person, self-inserted into the game. And while I think they keep it vague, I don't know if it's a mistake or not to give the pilot any sort of identity within the game itself. With regards to the level design and environment, they described it as bland, with no hook to incentivize exploration. But at least coming from the other games, that's not at all what I see in the gameplay footage. I see huge, expansive environments, with a lot of options of ways to get to the boss, and a lot of potential for exploration. Places to go off and fight other mini-bosses. Places to look for hidden parts. And maybe that's just it. Don't know enough about the series to know what the incentives are to go explore. To know that there are potentially other hidden bosses. To know that there are potentially hidden parts. And honestly, compared to some of the older Armored Core games and levels we had, this one is massively detailed. And since it's locked into a mission structure anyway, and they do talk about how much faster this gameplay is in comparison to the Soulsborne titles, I don't expect that the player would want to spend all of their time just exploring. I think they want to keep it as focused on the action as they can, while still giving the fans a little bit of something to explore around and find out. In that same way, I'm hoping that there's plenty of lore to discover while exploring as well, but only time will tell. They go on to say that the jetpacks, presumably the boosters, are essential for exploration. And while they don't dive into detail of it, I imagine the paths you take might also depend a little bit on your weight class, and that it might be worth going back and exploring a little bit more with something with a little bit more energy and lighter weight. But maybe with the jump platforms and everything else, you'll be able to get to everything no matter what you're piloting. They talk about how quick boost exists to dodge while assault boost is there to propel the mech forward, confirming that they do seem to be two related but individual mechanics, and that they're not all sort of lumped together under assault boost. In this part, From Software talks a lot about the omnidirectional movement, and how messaging around that movement is messy and difficult to communicate to their target audiences, which really are primarily your Soulsborne players, where there's not a whole lot of vertical movement or flight to be had within their games. It's mostly ground-based combat, and so the ability to fly up and that omnidirectional movement is going to be new for them. Though the interviewers did say that even though it's difficult to explain and practice, it does feel very intuitive, so I'm at least happy with that. They talk about the complete tempo change over Elden Ring and the other Soulsborne titles, how they're fairly slow and methodical, while Armored Core focuses on momentum and action combat. The interviewers talk about how it's arcadey with generous checkpoints and scoring systems, and offers relatively lenient action compared to Dark Souls until you get to the boss battles. And again, this goes to show that exploration has never been a massive part of the game. It's always been about the action and the combat. This is just further proof that it's not actually a Soulsborne game, but that it is Armored Core. The exploration is there, the lore is there, and the parts are there, in the background and in smaller quantities than Elden Ring, but the focus is really on the action. And in that way, it's distinctly different from Elden Ring and the other Soulsborne titles. So I can see why the interviewers might be a little bit disappointed here, but I think if you come at it from an Armored Core perspective, it's not surprising. And it's probably pretty much what we all expected. With regards to the bosses, we knew that they were going to make them harder, and I think we'll just have to get hands on the game to talk about the generous checkpoints and scoring system they mention here. Historically, most Armored Core levels are quite short, and while they've promised way longer levels here, and I'm sure that's why we have the healing and the checkpoint system, we don't really know what that looks like yet. And so it's hard to really speculate on it at all, at least with any sort of accuracy. With regards to the lenient action compared to Dark Souls, that makes sense. In Dark Souls, it's entirely possible that you're killed by just some random enemy in the field. But in Armored Core, that's never really been the case. There's always been a distinct power difference between your AC and all the small enemies on the ground. I think it's part of the game design that you're supposed to feel powerful until you get to these bosses. And while sometimes the enemies will swarm you or they'll gradually whittle you down, it's a very different design philosophy from Dark Souls, and that the small enemies aren't actually meant to be that challenging. Armored Core would lack that quick, arcadey, fast-paced action if every enemy you went up against took several minutes to kill or defeat. Had the ability to take you out. The small muscle tracers, of which they have confirmed that they're called muscle tracers, so MTs, just like the old games, shouldn't be able to just turn around and eliminate an AC. There's a reason you're an augmented human. There's a reason the technology that you have and the mech that you're piloting stands so far above the rest. There's supposed to be a power difference there. But they do go on to say that the attacks that you have are empowering and cinematic. And looking at the footage, there's definitely a step up from some of the other games, especially with regards to melee combat and just the fluidity of movement. Here, FromSoft confirms that there are no upgrades to the healing mechanic. You're stuck with the 3 you get, minus some of the resupply points that can restock them. They go on to say that managing your health and general performance is essential, as it ties into Armored Core's scoring system and economy. When talking about what happens when you die, they say Armored Core 6 eliminates some of the pain of death compared to the Soulsborne games. Some. Notably, when you die, you just reload at the last checkpoint and try again, keeping all of your resources. Don't expect to have to run after some equivalent of souls, or risk losing all of your progress. You're given the option to access the assembly screen to recalibrate your mech and its attachments to try for a better approach. While this may seem more forgiving than previous From Software games, boss fights still clearly carry crushing defeat. Fighting any boss in the game takes a while, so death means repeated time and effort. Masochists rejoice. And this is a spot that they've said they took the most inspiration from the Soulsborne titles, and it's a spot that I'm excited to see a little bit of change in. While some of the previous ACs did have some big epic boss fights, there are also ones that just seemed like a damage race. I'm excited at the possibility of something a little bit more methodical, where you have to really pay attention to your enemy's movements and adapt to their patterns to overcome it. From there, they say you get rewards at the end of each mission. Yamamura said, there are certain deductions or rewards based on your performance, how much damage you take, and additional objectives you've cleared. You get a new base income from missions, and then you can use that to buy parts and upgrade your mech. So again, while they don't give us a ton of specifics, it's sounding like classic Armored Core, where a mission pays a base amount, and then you get deductions for ammo and damage and things of that nature taken out of that. And while we don't know if you can actually go negative in money, it seems that you can rest assured that if you do a good job, you'll be able to upgrade and get new parts, and if you do a bad job, you'll be struggling. And that way it literally pays to get better. With regards to the garage, they say you have 12 customizable parts within 4 categories. There are 4 unit slots that hold artillery, swords, shields, and the like. And these are your classic weapon slots, 1 on each back shoulder and 1 in each hand. There are 4 frame slots, head, core, arms, and legs. There are 3 internal slots, FCS, your fire control system, your generator, and your boosters. And I talked a lot in my assembly breakdown video on YouTube about how it does seem to be simplified. They've shaved away a lot of the more redundant or extraneous parts, hopefully to make room for more quality parts in the categories that we do have. They've said a few times now that they don't want any of the parts to be meaningless, and that it shouldn't be a matter of just numbers, that there shouldn't be parts that are clearly better than others, but that each part should be unique. So while yes, I'm hesitant at the fact that they did strip out a few of the extra parts in the garage, though I think there's some that you could remove depending on the AC generation you're talking about, I definitely don't want it to feel overly simplified. I want it to be that complex, stat-based garage system that we're used to. In addition to those parts, you have 1 expansion slot that, in their words, enables unique abilities, like a massive electrical explosion. And anybody who played AC in its 4th generation will recognize that massive electrical explosion as assault armor. We knew that we were getting it. We knew it was in the game, albeit not utilizing Kojima particles. They were going to come up with a different way to frame assault armor. But we didn't know how it functioned. Ever since the garage footage, some speculation definitely has been that it's an expansion part, but we haven't had any sort of confirmation on that until now. And that's actually kind of interesting, because it means that you don't just have assault armor. Every AC doesn't have it. It means if you want to use something else in your expansion slot, you're going to have to give up assault armor to do it. In the same way, if we assume primal armor, which we also know that we have, is also an expansion slot, I imagine that they're probably going to be 2 individual expansion items, and not the same thing. Which is interesting in that it allows you to really lean offensive or defensive, depending on your playstyle and the mission. Though we still don't know exactly what the cost of them is or how it's going to function. Without Kojima particles and an additional bar such as Coral Energy, which we're fairly sure doesn't exist, I think it's a safe assumption it's based off of just your energy like any other energy weapon. Though I imagine there's a cooldown for it, and maybe that's what the cooling stat on your generators control, the cooldown on your expansion slots. I had talked a lot about that and predicted a lot of things in my YouTube video about it, and I think this falls right in line with those predictions. And I think without having Kojima particles in the game, and without it being a different red coral glow when it's used, it makes the most sense to do it in this way, just as an expansion slot, and an optional thing that your AC can do. It's nice too. There were plenty of people who played 4th generation that didn't use assault armor at all, and there were certain boosters that didn't have assault armor. In that same way, if it's something you don't intend to utilize, you can take it off and put on something else that you'll find more useful. They go on to say that there's dozens of available options in each category. And while I think that sounds like a lot to people who aren't necessarily initiated into Armored Core, that one's really going to depend on how they're defining categories here. Because honestly, with regards to even just hand weapons alone, 24 to 36 options, give or take, wouldn't scratch the surface of what some of the other games have really had with regards to weapon choices. But they're not real specific here. Are they defining categories as each individual weapon class, or just weapons overall? Is a category just bipedal legs, or are they talking about all legs collectively? While I think it can be a little confusing and concerning upon first read, we don't really even know what they mean by dozens. Do they mean 24? Or maybe they just quickly scrolled through it and there's actually hundreds of options. We're not real sure. They're fairly vague here. They do go on to say some of the things they saw are rifles, shotguns, grenade launchers, chain guns, bazookas, pulse cannons, double-bladed swords, and shields, in addition to everything that we've seen in the trailers as well. And this is another spot that I'm curious if it's just a matter of not knowing what they're looking at, or if they actually have shaved out some of the weapon categories. Because in some of the later generations, just those as options wouldn't even scratch the surface of what we could normally use. They go on to talk about how every customization slot is unlocked in the demo that they played. And does that mean that we won't start out with every option available? That we might not start out with the expansion slots available, or something to that effect? Or is it just a matter of them not being quite sure if you start out with everything or if you unlock things as you go? At least from a mechanic and lore perspective, I think it would be odd to lock certain categories of parts. Since it's equipped to an AC, and they're made to fit certain specifications, you would know if they can use expansion slots. You would know if this core is developed to be able to hold a back-left weapon. To me, with maybe the exception of expansion slots, and even that's pushing it, it doesn't really make sense to require you to unlock them later on. Especially since we know we don't have any sort of ultimate weapons to be unlocked later. Though we don't really know if there's any sort of human plus-ish feature that some of the other games have had that you'll unlock as you go through the storyline. That's a possibility. Though even then, since you're already an augmented human, I'm not so sure. A few other weapons that they list after that are the pulse scutum, a large shield used by ancient Romans and a few other armies. And presumably this is that over-the-shoulder shield we see used in the gameplay footage, as at least the shape of it kind of fits the bill. They also talk about a vertical missile launcher, and most notably a stun needle launcher, the latter firing a projectile that explodes into a ball of electricity. And I'm assuming this is going to look a lot like those plasma missiles. It'll probably be an AoE ball of energy that doesn't do that much actual damage, but has high stun potential. And that's one of the things I was hoping to see, is weaker weapons that have high stun values. So you can lean into either category that you want, or just do a mixture of both. Following that, they go on to say there will be extensive cosmetic options, near infinite combinations of user-generated aesthetics, from decals, paint jobs, finishes, and weathering. And even though they've briefly touched on this before, I still think it's exciting. Though we don't know what the decal and emblem maker is going to be like, that the paint jobs themselves are expanding, that we'll get different finishes and lusters, and the ability to weather our AC without putting in a ton of custom decal work to make it happen. They say that people can upload and share their creations online, which I think they've touched on before, but it's still nice confirmation. From there, the interviewers go on to see them face the EC0804 Smart Cleaner, colloquially known as the Roomba boss. And this is going to be that big mech with the grinder arms we've seen a couple of times in trailers and the recent gameplay footage. The interviewers talk about how the boss's weak point is a small open vent between the arms, presumably that little spot on the back end. while other people who attended the event at Summer Games Fest talk about it's the chimney or it's the head between its arms, so a little bit of debate there. And honestly, we do get damage numbers when you hit things, so it probably just depends on what sort of weapon you're using. Which is exciting too. It might be that an enemy's not just weak to energy weapons or just weak to kinetic, but it's going to depend on where you hit them at. Which is nice. It means if you like using missiles or you like using energy weapons, etc., you may not need to necessarily just change out your AC entirely just to deal with one boss. You might just have to shift up how you're fighting it. The FromSoft team talks about here that the one thing they've learned from Soulsborne games is observational boss battles. They want you to watch what the boss is doing, their patterns, their animations, and really learn how to fight them, as opposed to just powering your way through. And this is another spot where the interviewers say that normal engagements were pretty run-of-the-mill, at least in comparison to what they're expecting, while boss battles are cinematic and climactic. But as I was saying before, I think, honestly, that's kind of the point. Being able to wipe out wave after wave of small enemies is just fun, arcadey shooting. And that's part of what makes Armored Core. And then you get to your final big boss, and that's where the real challenge lies. And though don't get me wrong, I do want some really hard levels, and the level that they saw was really early on, so it's likely not all that challenging. I don't expect to be able to be killed by some random MT standing off to my left. Though with regards to the Smart Cleaner, they say it destroys their AC in 2 hits. Over half a dozen tries later, and the boss is finally down to its last shreds of health, but they run out of ammo and are defeated again. Which, just as a side note, and even though I'm sure they were just killed attempting it, this is why you carry a melee weapon and have the ability to kick in this one. At some point, you will run out of ammo. Unless they once again give us dual chain guns with a massive ammo pool, in which case, you might run out of money before you run out of ammo. Just imagine an active money pool in Armored Core where as you fire it depletes and as you defeat enemies it goes back up, and you can just see your funds draining as you fire. Wouldn't that make you conserve ammo just a little more? But from there, the actual gameplay footage is over. They talk about how most of FromSoft's fanbase is really from Soulsborne titles, and this is really a spot I actually really agree with them on. It's the truth. It's been a long time since there's been an AC game, and many of the players who used to be involved with the series aren't anymore. We can expect a huge wave of new people to come into the series. And if you want the game to do well, we need to embrace them. We need to meet them at where they're coming from, a Soulsborne game. If that's the comparisons that they can draw, if that's the lock-on that they want to talk about and compare it to, if that's what they're familiar with, let them make those comparisons. Honestly, there's lots of games with those various elements. Soulsbornes are just the ones that From Software developed. It's natural to compare the new Armored Core to the previous titles they're familiar with, and to find the mechanics that From Software has developed through those really successful titles that they've brought into Armored Core. And having a mechanic or two that they may share with older games doesn't make Armored Core a Soulsborne. It just makes it Armored Core, developed from the same company that made Soulsborne titles, developed with the mechanics that From Software has worked really hard at over the years to hone and perfect. Mechanics that, maybe some of them got Elden Ring Game of the Year. And that way, they're not bad. They may be different, but just look at the changes that have happened throughout the generations of Armored Core. Just look at Generation 4 to 5. There's a massive change in mechanics that happened. Did that make 5 a bad game? Some will say yes, but I think it's just different. I think it's still Armored Core, and it still had that same familiarity you're used to. And so will Armored Core 6. It might be mechanically a little bit different or updated, but it's still Armored Core. There's a line at the end of the interview that just reiterates this. Through and through, Armored Core 6 is an Armored Core game, for better or for worse. But that's going to do it for today's episode. I've got lots of new videos up on YouTube breaking down the recent gameplay footage, things after Summer Games Fest, breaking down the garage assembly screen, and talking about the various corporations and organizations that we see throughout the game, with much more to come. So definitely give that a watch as well. In addition, the word through the grapevine is that there's another press embargo that's due to be released fairly soon. So you can be sure when new information comes out that there'll be a new episode covering it. In addition to that, we've got a great episode coming up with some very special guests. So I hope you'll join me then. We're hoping for next week, but stay tuned. Till next time. Oh, looks like it's time to wrap things up. If you enjoyed today's broadcast, don't forget to follow, subscribe, and check out our Discord. You can find me at NoisyWren on YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter. And if you want to support the podcast, you can find me at patreon.com/NoisyWren. I appreciate the support. Coral is not cheap these days. As usual, the links are in the show notes. Till next time.
Connection terminated.